Hello, everybody. This is Neil here once again with the Gaming Hipster, episode number 4, and I have a special interview. Today I'm here with Mike James, otherwise known as UK Mike of Retro Gaming Roundup, the podcast that is the center of your retro gaming universe. He's also the author of the upcoming book Smoke and Mirrors, The Rise and Fall of a Serial Antipreneur. I had to read that a couple times. But, this is our first time talking, so why don't you tell us briefly a little bit more about yourself and how you met Mike Kennedy, and then we'll jump into the retro VGS debacle.
Okay, sure. I've only done this like a couple of times. Usually I'm interviewing other people. I've only done like 2 or 3 where people are interviewing me. So Each time I hear an intro to myself, it sounds like they're talking about somebody else. But no, I guess all that's true. So this goes back, oh my God, a lot of years to, it would be, I guess, early 2000s, maybe mid, 2000s, so 2004, 2005, something like that perhaps, maybe a little earlier. There was a podcast called Retro Gaming Radio. And they had their own forums, and we were all members on there. So I was on there, Mike Kennedy was on there, Scott Schreiber was on there, lots of other people as well. And for a time, it was a good and busy forum. But that show came to an end. But Mike Kennedy had started doing an audio segment on that show called Chase the Chuck Wagon. So what Mike did, he moved to California, late 90s, and he would go to the swap meets, pick up gaming stuff really cheap, and then sell it on eBay. And he got sick of paying eBay fees, so he started up his own auction site called Chase the Chuck Wagon, and he used Retro Gaming Radio as a vehicle to promote that, publicize that. And so, we met kind of through those forums, and I would hear him on that podcast. And then when that podcast ended, the 3 of us felt that, there was still room for a podcast about the hobby. And there weren't that many back then. There are tons of them now, but there weren't that many back then. So the 3 of us got our heads together and came up with Retro Gaming Roundup.
And I absolutely love the podcast. Unfortunately, I've fallen a little bit behind just being busy with my own stuff, doing my own show. But it's a 7-hour or more or less monthly podcast. It is you get a lot for a monthly podcast.
Yeah, it's a bit of a monster. Lots of people say they fall behind. We have people who save it up for a while, and then when they've got some work at home to do or something, or they're on a long drive, then they'll catch up that way. But it clocks in usually 5+ hours every month. So it is a commitment to listen to. It's a bigger commitment to make it, of course, but we're talking about our hobby, and we kind of describe it like a magazine style show. So there's different segments in it, and same as you would with a magazine, you pick it up. You don't read it cover to cover in one sitting. You might read an article here or there. There might be some that you're not interested in and you skip. There might be some that you read a couple of times. And I think, our podcast is similar.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It is a bit like going back to reading like GamePro or Nintendo Power, and you guys are hysterical. I was listening back to some older episodes just to get some material. I had to do a deep dive to reacquaint myself with some of the insanity and some of the names that were involved in this. But I went back and listened to some stuff, and there was just great stuff like. I remember you and Mike getting into this argument over who was the first video game mascot. That was great.
Yeah.
Oh, and there was one episode.
Yeah,
there was one episode where he had he came in with some top 10 pick where, and I don't remember what it was, but he thought it, which makes the story unfunny, by the way. But he was he had some pick where it was the perfect pick, and he put it in at number 1, and he was like, "This is the most obvious pick that I could have made." And both you and Scott were like, "No, out." And him losing his shit for I don't know, 5 minutes. He couldn't believe. Yeah. But anyway, when and how did this retro VGS thing come about?
So it goes back a long way, and the book, as you mentioned at the top, Smoke and Mirrors, to give it its short title, covers all of this. You know, there'll be people who know about the retro VGS and Coleco Chameleon, and they'll pick up the book and they'll want to get straight into the meat of that. But you can't just really do that. There's so much background to the story, and the book goes into it all. So, you know, we talk about who Mike Kennedy is, why he was in the position he was in, and some of the ideas he came up with. So, you know, the long title, The Rise and Fall of a Serial Entrepreneur, is because he was the kind of guy who would shotgun ideas, and they would be the best idea in the world, and then the next idea would come along, take attention away from the previous one, and then this current idea would be the best one in the world. And so there were lots of ideas that he had, mainly for different websites early on. You know, I mentioned Chase the Chuck Wagon, the auction site. That was purely video games, and then he started one that was more general, so there'd be toys on there and anything really. He was trying to rival eBay. And he had one called Gamer Spots, where, you know, if you were out in a town somewhere and you found, you know, a pinball machine or an arcade that wasn't that well known, you'd go on the Gamer Spots site, you'd drop on a pin on the map, and you'd put in a couple of lines of description. Then other people would go on the site, think, oh, I'm in this town. Oh, somebody's put an arcade on here. I'll go over there. So he was trying to build a community around our forums. So he had Chase the Chuck Wagon. Initially, he rebranded that as Game Gavel, and he was trying to build a community and the forums and, you know, all the auction sites around his Game Gavel kind of empire, if you like. And so he was trying to do all these things to build community, and he did a lot of good things. He had lots of ideas, some of them good, some of them terrible. And then the idea of, you know, a magazine came up, and that's what eventually turned into Retro Magazine. It didn't start out as that, and the book will go into all the backstory of how it evolved into Retro and then ended up on Kickstarter. And the idea of a console came up, and he was a salesman by trade, and he would have these ideas and he'd really sell you on them, and he'd do all the promo. And he pretty much got to a stage where he thought that was it. You know, what a good example of that is he came up with an idea where you would subscribe to a podcast. It could be audio or video, and it would be someone sitting in the car doing a podcast, because, you know, you spend a lot of time in your car commuting and driving around. You can use that time to do a podcast and people can listen. And he had all these ideas. You know, you could listen to one feed, you could watch another, you could subscribe, you could comment, you know, you could take part, and he had pricing for the apps and all of this without any idea of the back end that goes into something like that. But as far as he was concerned, you know, in a couple of months he was going to have an app on the App Store, and that's the way his mind worked. And he'd go into his sales patter, and if you weren't careful, you'd end up believing him almost. So we discussed the idea of a console with him, Scott, myself, and Mike, and the idea was his. Although, you know, it was around the time that the Atari flashbacks had been coming out and things like that, early on in those kind of console days. And so, you know, you'll learn from reading the book, these patterns of behavior start to emerge. So he'll take an idea and it will seem to be his, but isn't really. Like, you know, the car-based podcast one, that was somebody else's. They were already doing it, and he took it and, you know, fleshed it out a bit, if you like. And the console was the same. So we had some Skype calls, Mike, Scott, myself, and we had some industry people in. Ed Fries, who was from Microsoft, he managed the initial Xbox, whatever you want to call it. Their naming convention is stupid. It was the Xbox One, but not the Xbox One, if you like, you know, the original Xbox. He ran their game division at that time. We had Phil Adam, who was from Spectrum Holobyte, the guy responsible for bringing Tetris over to the West. And we had Steve Reuter, who had worked in the game industry. He'd worked at Atari, he'd worked at Apple. And we had these people in just throwing ideas around for this console. You know, what could it do? What would it be? What would the market be? Would it be new games? Would it be an emulation box? Because the Retron 5 was out at that time. The Retron 5 is basically a brand new video game console, wireless controllers, HDMI output, but it's got 5 cartridge slots in, and it takes your original cartridges. And we didn't just want to recreate that. So, we were thinking we would have new games, and people like Steve Woiter on the call just wanted to write games. That's what he does. He wanted to write video games for this thing. And then all of a sudden those calls kind of stopped. And so, Scott and I thought, the idea's dead kind of thing. And, Scott was supposed to be working on the hardware. Mike was going to be doing the software side. And that was advice that Ed Fries gave us. He said, there's loads of ideas flying about, but you need to, pin a few things down or you'll just end up going round in circles. He said, what you're talking about is a hardware company and a software company, and you need to split those off. And so Scott was taking the hardware. Mike was going to work with Steve on the software side of it. And so those calls stopped happening, and then a few months went by, and, we're doing a recording with Mike, and he talks about his hardware team. And so Scott was like, what? Your hardware team? And I thought I was the hardware team. And Mike had sort of taken that idea, cut us out of it, soft fired us, if you like, and brought some new people in and was working on it with them. So that is what became the Retro VGS. And of course that then evolved later into the Coleco Chameleon. So that's where the idea kind of came from.
And this console, just looking at it from like a consumer perspective, an enthusiast perspective, it kind of, I always thought that the idea was kind of a niche thing. Like I was like, who exactly is this for? I never really, I don't mean to insert my own personal opinion into this, but that's what I was thinking at the time. And then the more things moved along, the more I was like, this sounds. There was always something about it that I was a little suspicious of, and it didn't really start to form in my head that something was really wrong until you guys had that interview on episode 91. And it's a very polite interview. It's a very jovial interview, but there are threads in that interview that seem kind of it's like a deposition, or like kind of like trying to pull things out of Mike, and like stuff that actually was volunteered to that episode that revealed that you guys were in on it, or were that's the wrong way to put it.
That episode was so funny, and it's so one of Mike's patterns of behavior, which, I mentioned all his ideas and his various sites that he built early on. So he had patterns of behavior, and until the console came along, Scott and I were friends with him. We worked with him closely on a lot of stuff, and we did the podcast every month, and we spoke a lot, and certain things would crop up during those years, but you just never missed it because there was no history, there was no previous examples of suspect behavior kind of thing, and we kind of dealt with them and moved on. But then when I started to write the book and look back at those early ideas and some of the stuff that had happened, you think, oh my God, how did I miss that? And he had what we call in the book the Mike Kennedy business model. And when we go into the Mike Kennedy business model, and the patterns of behavior repeated. And so what Mike would do, he would take somebody else's idea and he would flesh it out. And the next thing you know, it's his idea. And he would bring people in to help him because he didn't know how to do this stuff. He was a salesman. He either had an idea or stole someone else's, but then couldn't bring that to fruition. He wasn't technical in any way, so he didn't know how to do these things. So he needed to bring people in to help them, but he didn't want to pay them. He didn't have the money to pay them, so he would give them shares in Game Gavel LLC. And it was, their payment was perceived future value is one of the ways he described it. And, when you're receiving your pay in perceived future value, this is going to be huge, it's going to be amazing, we're going to take off, you're going to be so rich. And then when he got all the ideas he could out of you, and he wanted some new ideas maybe, or he wanted to maybe stop paying you or stop working with you, if you challenged him on certain things. There's some good examples in the book of that, people who made life difficult for him by asking questions. He no longer wanted to work with them and would offer to buy back the shares, but now, it's not really gone anywhere. I'll give you, this much per share or whatever. And so the shares were currently worthless when he was buying them back. And so anyone who'd worked on one of his projects and were then either soft fired or publicly fired was then blamed for all its failures. And, their input was diminished. He would say, oh, well, yeah, he worked with me for a bit, but, it never really went anywhere. His input was minimal kind of thing. And so, what we wanted on record was, either Mike or somebody else admitting that, yes, we had been involved in the early days of this console. And that interview that you mentioned, that was our method of getting that. So he was in promo mode, thinking we're publicizing his console, and we were, as you say, in deposition mode. And it was so funny, completely unprompted right at the beginning. Steve Wojter pipes up and says, yeah, Scott, I remember in the early days, we were all working together on this. And then, without us even saying it, it just, all the pieces fell into place, and Mike just dug himself deeper and deeper in, completely involuntarily, not realizing, what was going on.
That's hysterical. I love the parts of the discussion where you guys were talking about, like, there's no cartridge slot cover. There's a problem with, like, putting the hardware inside of the case. It was, it's very interesting, like them just, giving up that information on the podcast. It's like, this doesn't it's like,
yeah,
it just made me more and more skeptical about this console. Like, this doesn't sound like something I'd want to buy.
No. And that was the thing, so Mike had bought the Atari Jaguar shell injection molds, and they'd been on sale on eBay a few years previously, and they hadn't sold, and so they were just sitting in a warehouse. And for those who don't know, these injection molds were the tooling that was used to make the Atari Jaguar shell. And he had the tooling for the Jag shell, and he had the tooling, I think, for the CD unit, but he wasn't going to use that. And he had, what was the other thing he had? I forget. But he'd bought this, and he'd paid $6,000 for it. And so he did a run of brand new production Atari Jag shells in various colours, and he sold quite a few of them and made the money back that he'd invested. And so he was going to use the Jag shell for the Retro VGS / Coleco Chameleon. And like I said earlier, he was a salesman. He had no technical knowledge. And as far as he was concerned, he had the idea. He knew people who wrote video games. He had the shells, and that was it. That was 90% of the problem done. Yeah. Next step, console. That was the way his mind worked. And so there was problems with the slot. It didn't have a slot cover. The back of it had been modified, but that had helped them out. So the people who bought the molds from Atari originally used it to make a dental camera. And there are pictures of that dental camera in the book on the ColecoChameleon.org website. And so he'd bought them, out of this warehouse, and that was it. So they were stuck using this shell. So the hardware designer coming in, whoever it was at that time, and there were a few of them, had to work within the confines of that shell. And, they talked in that interview, like you said, about some of the problems that caused, whereas Mike thought, oh no, this is the most of it done. So, whereas any normal sane person, like these flashback units, you would design your PCB, your motherboard, and then you'd build a case around it, and you'd do it really cheaply in China and get them produced by the thousands really cheaply. Whereas he was going about it completely the other way. But you mentioned earlier, who was this console for, and what exactly was it? Mm-hmm. But that was constantly changing. I mentioned every time Mike spoke to somebody, he would pick up buzzwords, and he'd pick up technical terms or just great little nuggets and sound bites. And then some of them he would have no clue what they meant, but he would repeat them to the next person in the line, and they would think, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about, and he would get more little sound bites from them. And he built up this huge, almost bank of sound bites that he'd throw out there at people. And so anything you think a video game console could do, this thing was going to do, and he had no clue about the work that created. So something as simple as they were going to use a wired controller, and then somebody said, or he had the idea, whichever, we want Bluetooth controllers or wireless controllers. And so he said, oh yeah, we're going to have wireless controllers. Well, that means you redesign your circuit board again. You've got to put in the Bluetooth unit. You've got to put in extra power to run that. You've got to put extra processing power in to run it. And so you go from one processor to another. That brings its own problems with sockets and things like that and layouts. And so every little thing that he threw in meant the design had to change. And so when we did that interview, John Carlson was the engineer at the time, and he was much maligned by many people and mocked. But I've spoken to John a lot, and even as recently as last night, we were emailing each other. I like John. I think he's a good guy. I think he's a good engineer, and I have no real engineering knowledge to that depth. I'm technical. I work in the IT industry, but obviously these people know processors much more than I do. And I speak to him, and I've spoken to other people from the industry who've worked with John, and all of them, to a man and woman, say, John's a good engineer. Give John a job to do and he can do it. Whereas Mike, blamed John for all its failings. But Steve Woiter and Mike were throwing ideas at John and saying, it has to do this, it has to do that. So John would go out and get pricing for this stuff and put a board layout together or whatever, or mock it up. And he'd come back to them with the cost, and they said, well, that's far too expensive. And he's saying, well, you're saying it has to do this. This is what you need to do. And so every time something changed or they had another idea, everything went back to the drawing board. And so they never really had anything to show to the public. And that was one of the bones of contention. They had no prototype. They showed plenty of them, but they were fakes. They had nothing because they simply couldn't decide on a final design.
Mike was constantly in imagination mode. Like you said, he would constantly throw out new amazing things the consoles could do. And his ideas for software was just totally bonkers. Like he'd come up with some, like current gen game, and he'd be like, imagine a 16-bit version of, such and such. And I'm like, who is this for? What does that even mean? What kind of console are you making, Mike Kennedy? And
well, he was kind of aiming it at the collector market. Yeah. So the thing that Mike wanted to fix, some people think it's broken, some people don't, but we're moving from physical games to digital games. Mm-hmm. You think about the NES, the Super NES, the Mega Drive, Genesis, whatever. People would buy those cartridges and stick them on a shelf and get pleasure out of having them and looking at them. And people collected these things, and collectors will pay thousands and thousands of dollars for just one game because it's collectible, because it's rare, and they want to own it. And Mike was looking at all these new games coming out on the digital stores, whether it's Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo, or whether it's Steam. You weren't getting anything other than a game that you could play, but it wasn't collectible. And Mike wanted to be able to pick up a game cartridge that had, for want of a better example, Flappy Bird on it, and be able to stick that in a console in 30 years' time and play it. That was the problem Mike was fixing. Now, some people describe this console as a solution without a problem. Other people felt, all right, I can see the nugget of an idea, but is it a mass market, product? And the problem with it is, and I think it was Ben Heck who described this the best, people collect things for nostalgia. When you pick your cartridge up off your shelf and put it in your SNES today, you're recreating that moment from when you played it as a kid, and it has value and it has nostalgia associated with it. Whereas the retro VGS had none of that, because they were modern games that you were simply putting on cartridge.
Right.
And none of these games have that same nostalgia. And so to create that collectability, a false collectability, Mike would constantly throw out, the first 50 are going to be in a gold shell. Then we'll do red shells. Then we'll do blue, or they'll all be black, and we'll do 5% of them in gold. And you never know which you're going to get. And he'd do the same with Retro Magazine, do the same issue but with a different cover to try and build that false collectability and try and create that market where it didn't really exist.
Never thinking if anyone's actually looking for this.
No, to him it was a wonderful idea and it was going to save the world. To everyone else, it was just meh. But he would give pricing out for, one of these cartridges. So you go on, I use the example Flappy Bird, we might as well stay with that. You go on Steam or whatever and buy Flappy Bird, what is it? Or what was it? $5 at the most. But to put that on a physical cartridge, burn it into a ROM, put it inside a cartridge shell, put it inside a case, ship it to somebody, this thing is going to cost, the pricing I think he gave was between $30 and $60 for a game.
For Flappy Bird.
Yeah, most of them not being more than $49.99. Well, who is going to pay $30 for Flappy Bird on a cartridge, the whole thing was just crazy and completely lost its way. But, he had to do this because he didn't want it just to be another emulation device like, the Retron 5, although it would do emulation and that's what he wanted built in. It was just kind of going to be all things to everyone and it was the best idea in the world when really it wasn't.
It seemed like he was trying to make what was eventually the analog NT and all those systems, but like all in one. And I imagine that eventually there's going to be some system like that, like maybe 10 years down the line, where like the Retron 5, there's like 5 cartridge slots and it's all FPGA, maybe. But it was just, but even then it would be kind of like a boutique item. I couldn't see that as like a mass market type of console. And besides, I understand the desire for like a cycle perfect replication of the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, but a lot of people, I'd say like 90% of the gaming market, really doesn't care that much. So I'm happy enough just with Steam and like all the retro games. It's actually like the best time ever to be a retro gamer. You could play like Shovel Knight and a new one came out. I forget the name. I think it's like I don't know. But yeah, there's like a whole bunch of these retro themed games that are more or less like playing NES and Super Nintendo, except way better because they don't have any of the limitations or anything. So like again, I was just like, this seems like it's just the wrong way to address a market for retro today, because there is a market for it, but like I have no desire to like go back to cartridges, especially the price point. I don't want to pay like $40 for a cartridge.
No. And if you think about it, the people who want a hardware device that they can just plug a cartridge in, those kind of people already have an NES. Yeah. They already have a Genesis. They already have the cartridges. They don't need another one that does the same thing. They'll already have an old TV that shows that signal properly rather than, distorting it on a flat screen. And even then, there are devices that, will upscale and you can change settings on them for various consoles and they will make your Super Nintendo look good on a flat screen TV. But those kind of people are few and far between, and the rest of the people really don't care. Like you say, you'll jump on Steam, buy a retro game or a reimagining of a retro game and just play it and not care.
Yeah, they'll go out and they'll get like the analog NT, like I said, or they'll pay someone like Voltar to put in like an HDMI mod to their system, and they'll be happy enough with that.
Yeah, the analog NT is a really interesting and ironic example because the guy behind that, the guy who engineered it, is Kevin Horton. Mm-hmm. He goes by the name of Kev Triss online, and he was dealing with Mike. Mike wanted Kev Triss because Kev Triss was already working on the NT products and early prototypes and various prototypes that he'd made to emulate the different consoles. And there's a list in the book of some of the consoles that he had working via FPGA. And he was doing it in his own time, and he was doing it relatively cheaply. It's not a cheap thing to get into, having motherboard PCBs printed, but relatively cheaply. And Mike was coming out with price points for various things, and Kevtris was coming out saying, no, I can do it far cheaper. I've already got this thing working. And so when you have an FPGA, so basically an FPGA is kind of like a processor, but you can change the way it works.
Right.
If you if you build a processor to do a certain task, that's it. Once you've burned that ROM to that processor, that's what it does. It doesn't do anything else. An FPGA, you can kind of move the gates around inside it, if you like, for want of a better example, but you can make an FPGA do various things. And so you could make it pretend that it's a Game Boy, pretend that it's a Super Nintendo, if you like. And he was doing this, but to do that, you need software cores to run alongside that. Not only do you need the FPGA as the hardware, you need the software cores to go with it. And Kevtris had written his own. He had these things working. And so Mike was going to license them from him and put them in the Retro VGS and Coleco Chameleon, but he just completely mismanaged that relationship to the point where Kevtris just said, no, I'm out. I'm not working with you anymore. You're on your own, good luck, kind of thing. And so, Kevin went his own way, and now you see his range of products, the Analog NT, the Super NT. There's one just come out, I think, last month that does the PC Engine. I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but he's bringing out products, and, where's Mike?
Snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Losing Kevtris was, a lot of people said was Mike's biggest mistake. And the the constantly shifting sand, which made it so that no one could develop a prototype for this thing, which led to some of the biggest embarrassments. Might as well jump right to the. I guess we'll jump right to the New York Fair. the Jaguar shell with a suspiciously familiar board inside.
It was, yeah. So one of the questions that comes up and gets kind of misquoted is how many fake prototypes there were. I count it as 3. So the first one that I count was the Retro VGS in the John Carlson video, with just the picture is in the book, and it's just his kitchen table with a few screens on, an oscilloscope, a soldering iron, and just scraps of spare parts and wires and some circuit board or other underneath a Jag shell. And so I would count that as the first. And yes, he's got something running and moving things around on screen, but it is not a video game console. And that video came out in the early days of the Indiegogo campaign before the Retro VGS. And it was meant to turn the campaign around, which was doing horribly at the time. And it did the exact opposite. So that Indiegogo campaign, just to give people an idea on numbers, they were looking for $1.95 million. So just shy of $2 million to bring this product to market. And that money was going to pay for offices. It was going to pay people's salaries. It was going to pay for development work that they claimed to have already done. It was going to bail out Game Gavel. It was going to bail out Retro Magazine. And it was going to do anything but produce a video game console. And so that campaign died within days, and they tried to end it to save their embarrassment. But the way Indiegogo works, because people had backed it, unless every single one of them asked for a refund, they had no way on their system of killing that campaign. So it was just like watching a fly kicking its legs lying on its back for the best part of a month, I think it was, as this thing just dragged on and on and on. And so as they had just shy of $2 million target. I think the highest they got might have been as high as $80,000, but it tended to loiter around the $60,000 mark. So that gives you some idea of how well it was perceived. And so in that first week of that campaign, and after that John Carlson video, he left the team, and he had an agreement with Mike that he would kind of just leave and, not announce it to people, just so that if by any chance the campaign did get lit up and start funding, there'd be no kind of bad press. But then Mike kind of either forgot that little arrangement or just because he can't control his mouth, let out that John Carlson had been fired and John Carlson is responsible for this thing failing, or, all, like I said earlier, any bad points associated with the idea were attributed to John Carlson because he was no longer there, and in comes the next engineer kind of thing. And so then the Retro VGS campaign dies, it goes away, and then it comes back, not as the Retro VGS anymore, but as the Coleco Chameleon. And so he'd been trying to kind of get a big name behind it all along, and Coleco was the one he ended up with. He'd approached a lot of people, and they all said no. The one who kind of came closest was in television. Keith Robinson, the late Keith Robinson now, was a friend of our show. We've interviewed him many times on the show. We'd hang out with him at Classic Gaming Expo. One of the things Keith liked to do was at the end of an expo, while all his team disassembled the booth and packed it away, he'd go and be interviewed, so we didn't have to do any of that work. And generally he'd be in our booth having a beer and doing an interview. So we all knew Keith. We had personal as well as, kind of, if you want to call it, professional relationships with him. And Mike had approached him to get in television branding behind it. But because in television had current product out in the market, whichever way this console of Mike's went could maybe adversely affect them. And that kind of scared them off, so they walked away. And the one that Mike went with was Coleco. Now, this isn't Coleco Vision. It's the name Coleco. And that name is dead. They haven't made product for decades. But there's a company called River West Brands, and they buy up all these dead old names from products from years ago, and they try and bring life back into them and make money out of either licensing that name or doing something with that name themselves. And they owned the Coleco name, but they had no product to go with that. And so Mike came along, and they agreed to put their branding on it. It could have been a money spinner for them, and it was great for Mike because he had this name Coleco on the console. So it came back as the Coleco Chameleon, and Coleco were a big name. They had some weight in the industry, not so much at this time, but certainly years ago. But they got into the biggest toy fair in the world, which is the New York Toy Fair every February. And just to give you an idea of how big this toy fair is, you remember the old home Atari Pong machines from the 70s?
Oh, yeah.
So Atari took their prototype Pong machine to the New York Toy Fair to show it off to the industry. And so that's how well respected this toy fair is. And then along comes Mike. He's given a table in the Coleco booth. They were there offering, various other ideas and just to get a presence there kind of thing. And they had a table with Mike's Chameleon on it. And he was running Super Nintendo games on it. He had a cartridge that had a few games on to demo. And so this unit was on there. People would walk up, pick up the controller, and play games on it. Now, it's kind of difficult to talk about an individual part of this story, which is why the book's so damn long, because there is so much information to get across to the reader.
Yeah.
But one of the engineers Mike had was a guy called Sean Robinson, who has a criminal past, which he owns up to. Nothing else he can do. But he also had a reputation for defrauding people out of money, selling them apparently rare working arcade games, and then when it arrives at their house, it's a beat-up old generic cab kind of thing. So he had this reputation, and so when he was working with Mike on this console, on the Chameleon, he said to Mike, I don't want my name out there, just keep my name out of it, but I'll help you through this toy fair kind of thing. And so there's a debate, and it's still going on, even as recently as 2 or 3 days ago. I can't say too much, but Sean is still denying having built that toy fair prototype. He says Mike did it, Mike said he did it. And both of them are liars, so we'll never truly know. Yeah. But basically what was inside that Chameleon shell at the New York Toy Fair was a product called the Super Nintendo Junior, sometimes called the Super Nintendo Mini. And it is a fully fledged Super Nintendo. It's just a smaller form factor. That's all. But fortunately, it fits inside a Jaguar shell. And if you use insulation tape in the right places, you can hide the bits that you want to hide and also have the cartridge slot line up. So that's what they had at the New York Toy Fair. They were playing Super Nintendo games because they had a Super Nintendo. Now, one of the problems they had at the Toy Fair was that demo unit kept on resetting itself. And Sean had told Mike, look, this thing's really delicate. You've got to be careful. Do not show anyone the back of the unit. And just when you it, be really careful. So what does Mike do?
He takes a picture of it.
He took a picture of it. As the Toy Fair's going on, people are asking on Facebook, on Twitter, on the Atari Age forum, show us round the back, show us the cartridge slot, show us this. And so he took a picture of the back of it, like you say, and posted that. And almost immediately, someone identified it as a Super Nintendo Junior because of the way the outputs and the power input all lined up, and the fact he was playing Super Nintendo games. And he also had a cartridge called the SD to SNES, which is basically a flash card for the Super Nintendo. So it's the same as a Super Nintendo cartridge on the outside, but it has an SD card slot in it. You put your game ROMs on the SD, put it in the cartridge, put the cartridge in the console, and you get a menu of all the games, and you can play them. Then you can finish one, go back to the menu, play a different one. Now, one of the problems with that SD to SNES, to make all that magic happen, it has additional hardware inside it, as you might expect. And that additional hardware requires additional power. And if you don't have a power supply that's good enough and reliable enough to deliver that extra power, the console kind of freaks out and, it suddenly can't process what it needs to process and resets. And that's what was happening. But Mike was telling the world, no, this cartridge I've got here is one my engineers built for me. We're running our own software. And I mentioned earlier, these software cores that Kev Triss had written. And Mike said, no, our engineers written their own, within a matter of weeks, whereas it had taken other people years to do this development work. Mike had suddenly turned it around in weeks, and they produced their own cartridge and their own prototype, and everything was normal. Don't worry, nothing to see here, when really it was anything but.
Really is his own worst enemy. I just imagine like some guy with like a gag nose and glasses trying to sneak something past Atari Age, which is like the world's greatest sleuths, all working against him. It's like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And him having no idea how any of this works. Like, I remember something about that where he didn't understand that like a stock Super Nintendo had the two side things on the cartridge slot where the extra pins go for like the Super FX chip. Like like someone else brought a cartridge, and because it didn't have that, he was like, well, that won't work in my system. And it's like, yeah, it is. Yeah, it will, because most Super Nintendo games don't have the two side pins, but he didn't understand that.
Yeah, exactly. And it just shows his lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, while repeating all the buzzwords that make it sound like he does. So one of the things the book goes into, among many, kind of one of the later chapters is almost a summing up or conclusion, if you like. We present the evidence on both sides throughout the book, and then we, kind of draw some likely conclusions. I don't force my opinion on the reader. And, a good detective will tell you follow the evidence, and wherever that leads is where you end up. You don't build, you don't say, right, this guy did it and I'll make the evidence match it. I present you the evidence, and that will take you to certain conclusions. But there are a couple of points that we don't exactly know. And one of them is, like I said, did Sean build that prototype? Or did Mike build that prototype? And if Sean built it, did Mike know it was a fake, or did Mike not know it was a fake? Well, the evidence is going to point you one way, if Mike took a picture of the back of it and showed it to the world. So, if he knew it was a Super Nintendo, would he have done that? So was Sean scamming him, or, was Mike getting what he asked for? And when I say that, what I mean is, early on in the retro VGS days, before it quite became the retro VGS, Mike and Sean were working on this idea, and Sean knew a guy called Clay Cowgill. Now, Clay lives in Portland, Oregon. He's part owner of a great arcade up there called Ground Control. He is an engineer by trade, and he brings products to market, some of them very well known. And he did some design work for Mike on some loose kind of specs that Mike had given him, and he did a few weeks' work on it, and up to the point where he was no longer willing to work for free. And the conclusion of those prototype ideas and that work he did for Mike was, you're going to need around 14 weeks and around $70,000 to get to a first prototype. But bear in mind, a first prototype doesn't always work. And so Mike had these numbers: 14 weeks, $70,000. And Clay's account of the result of that was, well, what can we do with smoke and mirrors? Which is where the book title comes from.
Right.
So that kind of steers you down a path of, did Mike ask Sean to build him a fake to get them through the toy fair? If they'd have had a great showing at that toy fair and they'd fooled the industry and they'd got someone like, Toys R Us or Sears or Atari interested in either buying it, selling it, or making games for it, then it was a win for them. So they needed something to get them through that toy fair with a good showing. So, you will kind of be, at the end of the book, you'll have your own opinion on whether, Mike asked Sean for a genuine prototype and got scammed, or whether Mike and Sean came up with this prototype to get them through that toy fair.
And in either case, it just seems like the kind of strategy that might have worked a few decades ago, but they just picked the wrong decade to do it in, because now that everything's on the internet, on video, you could just see video within minutes of it being recorded, and like I said, you got all these sleuths on Atari Age that are immediately able to do the research and bust them.
Oh yeah, and I mean this isn't unheard of. Lots of people, big companies, go to toy fairs and computer electronic shows with fake product, but it's an early prototype. So Commodore did it in their very early days with the VIC-20. They didn't have a running VIC-20, but made it appear like they did. When the first Xbox was being shown, they were running games on PCs kind of behind the scenes, where, there was an Xbox up front, but the games weren't actually running on it. But you knew Microsoft was going to build a product and come up with the Xbox. This was just a fake with no real answer at the end of it, And you talk about the sleuths at Atari Age. I think the best one was, so after the toy fair, Mike was still kind of ignorant and saying, no, don't worry, we're going to do this. We'll have this prototype. Don't worry.
I know where this is going.
I'm going to go to Kickstarter. Yeah. So then, we get to what I count and what most people count as the third fake prototype. So there was, a picture shown of a Coleco Chameleon under a clear shell, and it was sat right in front of a TV that was showing their game menu and all the games that were on the cartridge that was in it. And this thing right up front had a big bright red power LED underneath that clear shell, because one of the criticisms leveled at the Toy Fair prototype was it was a black shell, so you couldn't see inside it, and there was no power light. They hadn't even got a power light, so they fixed that for the third fake prototype. And so this thing, it was kind of sat almost under the TV, but not quite, so you couldn't see. You could see cables going to the TV, but you couldn't see that they were coming from the console. You could see cables going from the console, but then couldn't really see whether they went to the TV or not. And this was, at this time, a clear Jag shell, as I say, with that bright red power LED in there. And there was a circuit board inside. It was blue, and you could see some of the chips on it. And this was where the internet and Atari Age really came to save the day, because somebody identified that circuit board. And whereas Mike claimed, this is our board, this is our motherboard, we've had this made, we've produced it, they'd done anything but. For a start, it was blue, and that usually adds an extra cost to a board to have it dyed blue. Most are green, certainly prototypes anyway. And there was insulation tape visible on it. There were apparently some USB slots on the front, but they didn't seem to sit quite right, like they were soldered onto the board. So they were likely just hot glued on. And what this circuit board was a PCI card from a CCTV system. It was a DVI capture card. And so all they'd done is hot glued some USB sockets on the front and put insulation tape over the connectors on the side of the PCI board where, it would slot into your motherboard. And this was exposed. I think it took a couple of days. I think the pictures were posted on a Friday, and I think maybe the Saturday or the Sunday it was exposed, and those pictures quickly disappeared.
As I recall, it was the fact that it had like a cluster of capacitors, and it took a while for someone to come up and say, that's usually for some kind of like video type equipment, like a DVR or something like that, and that's what got people on the right path.
I think it was actually one of the chips. So one of the chips on the board had a brand name on, and I think there was something about it. I think it was because it was upside down, and this company, for some reason, branded their name upside down or whatever, and so it was quite easy to, I say easy, it made it easier to narrow down, what it could be, because that company and that chip were associated with, video capture and that kind of thing. So then it was just a case of finding the right board.
And like you said, it took a little bit longer, but it didn't take that long.
Yeah.
And it was just, and after that, of course, Coleco put some sort of ultimatum on them. They said, like, you need to show us within so many days that you have a working prototype. And of course, they backed out because what could they show them?
Yeah. So that whole thing was funny as well, because that weekend actually is probably the last time that I spoke to Mike. Well, not spoke. I emailed him. Maybe a bit of alcohol was involved, but I'd looked at these fakes and I'd been reading through stuff, and I just thought, what is this guy doing? And I just emailed him 2 or 3 lines, copied Scott in, and I said, Mike, 3 fakes is a lot. Sell the molds and move on. And that was it. So then, a few hours later, bearing in mind time difference and sleep and all of that, I get a reply. Scott copied in, of course, so he'd hit reply all. Completely ignored my message and asked Scott if he could give him a call to talk through things. And Scott was in no mind to do that. And so that was actually the last communication I had with Mike.
Yeah.
So yeah, Coleco saw all this, and so there's a podcast out there called the Coleco Visions, and one of the guys on there is Willie Culver. He also does the Arcade USA YouTube channel. Great channel, you should go and check it out. And Willie was a friend of ours. We've known Willie a long time. When we ran CG 2014, he was the head of the arcade department, and he helped us out big time with that. And Scott does some episodes of another one of Willie's channels, The Toy Tomb. Scott has a lot of collectible toys and RC stuff, and Willie's done videos with him about that. So Willie Culver all the way through this was kind of sat on the fence, Maybe Mike was lying, maybe he wasn't, but he didn't want to fall out with Mike. Willie's just a nice guy. He didn't want to fall out with Mike. He didn't want to fall out with us. So he was kind of stuck in the middle. But after that third fake prototype, he kind of saw, this is just ridiculous.
I remember seeing his post. It was like, holy moly. I believe that was his, that's what he posted.
Yeah. And so because he did the Coleco Visions podcast, he had a relationship with a guy called Chris Cardillo over at Coleco. The guy behind the licensing the brand to Mike. And so Willie said to Chris, look, you're in trouble. Here's a guy I think you should speak to. And it was Scott. And so Scott and Chris got in touch and had a conversation. And so Scott outlined to Chris Cardillo the entire history of the console. When Mike came to you with the Chameleon idea, that was not the first iteration. here's what happened before, here's what's happened under your watch kind of thing, and you need to be very careful and try and salvage your reputation. And so Chris listened to all of that, but what Scott said to him was, don't take my word for it. I'm off to work now. You spend the day doing your research, look at what's been posted online, read through some information, and we'll talk later kind of thing. So they spoke later, and Chris was just like, wow, I've been had over, haven't I? And Scott said, well, probably yes. But, Chris isn't a technical guy. He had no knowledge of, the technicalities of what putting a SNES inside a Jag shell, meant and why they'd done it. And so he needed help with that. So Scott said, what you need to do is give them, 48 hours to have them send over their prototype units. And so they had this back into, and Chris said, well, we've got to be fair. We've got to do the right thing. And 7 days is a common grace period kind of thing. We'll give them 7 days to send over the prototypes, and then I want you to look at them. And Scott said, well, because of my involvement with it, he said, I'm happy to, be with you when these things arrive and go through and look at what they are. But he says, anything I tell you, I want you to get verified. Go to your local university and have their, technical guy go through it and verify, what you have or haven't got kind of thing. And so they had this conversation, and Chris reached out to Mike and said, right, Mike, you've got 7 days to send me all your prototypes. And if, they're found to be real, we'll carry on working and we'll get through this. If they're found to be fake, we're out and you're on your own kind of thing. And there began a week of conversations between Mike and Chris Cardillo. Well, I really don't want to post them. They're very delicate. It keeps resetting. And, Chris said, look, send me the stuff. And then it'd be like, well, if I send it you, it's our intellectual property. You could take that to someone else. And Chris is just like, Mike, send me your stuff or I'm out. And obviously,
the dog ate
that
it.
never happened. So within 4 or 5 days, I think Mike just said to Chris, I'm not sending you anything, just, thanks and we're out kind of thing. But one of the times, just out of sheer irony, one of the times that Scott was on the phone to Chris Cardillo, putting the final nail in the coffin of the Coleco Chameleon, Scott got an incoming call from Mike Kennedy. So Mike's trying to phone Scott to save the situation while Scott's putting the final nail in with Chris Cardillo.
Oh my God. And full disclosure, I backed this book. Congratulations on a successful Kickstarter campaign. I look forward to reading it. I'll probably do a review at some point in the future. And I think that's gonna wrap up the show. Oh, I did put out something for questions from listeners, but of course, new podcast. I don't have a lot of listeners yet.
Yeah.
But anyway, I got the same question over and over, so it's really just one. It's a rhetorical question. They want to know, how is Mike Kennedy not in jail?
Well, there were legal cases prepared, so. When Mike was giving away shares of Game Gavel, there were certain things that should have been done. So when he sold a share, the people receiving it should have signed a form. Any existing shareholders should have signed a form to say, yes, we give permission for that person to come on board kind of thing. None of that was done. But he did have a lot of investors, but most of them were family. The only person I think who wasn't family, who paid for shares, there were other people who had them, people like Phil Adam, who I mentioned earlier, were given shares to help Mike out. The only person who wasn't family who paid for them was Scott. And the amounts are in the book, the percentage he got, the amount paid, and it was a few $1,000s. And so when Mike bought the Atari Jaguar molds, he bought them under the Game Gavel company, which Scott was a shareholder in. When they made the console, he started up a new company. And there were several companies. We go into further detail in the book. But he shifted those molds over to ownership of the new company. So that cut out all the shareholders of Game Gavel from any potential profits made from those those shells and the console. And over here, that's called asset stripping and is illegal. It is an offence over there as well. I'm not quite sure if it's called the same thing, but you just can't do that. And so, let's say the Retro VGS got funded, got their $2 million, and this was the bone of contention at the time, with Scott in particular and with others who weren't financially involved. Even if this thing gets funded, you will not get a console. We were telling people that. Even if they get their $2 million and you back it, you will not get a console. And the reason for that is, as soon as Mike Kennedy had any money, he was going to be sued. And Scott took legal advice on this, had a legal case ready to go, and at the end of it, his lawyer said, Mike's got nothing. You can't sue for nothing. You're going to put your own time and money into this, and at the end of it, he's got nothing. If he gets his $2 million, then the next day we'll hit him with this lawsuit, and that lawsuit would have dragged on and on and on, and those $2 million would have gone down and down and down, and there would have been no console. So part of the reason he wasn't sued was because he had nothing, 20% of nothing's nothing kind of thing. So it wasn't worth suing him. Why he isn't in prison? He has committed probably, I'm told, so I don't need to say allegedly, but I'm told he's committed felony offences. Why they haven't been pursued, I don't know. This thing just didn't really hit the mainstream. It got on some of the gaming press, but a lot of that is just copy-paste, looking for click-throughs kind of thing, without any real journalistic investigation. So it never really got to the level of catching people's attention. And, at the end of the day, Mike walked away with nothing. He had to sell his house, he had to sell his yacht, he lost his job, his company car, all of that. And so he had nothing and just kind of drifted away, and so if he'd still been on the radar and come back with another idea, then, maybe that would have caught enough attention. I don't know, but that is probably why.
Yeah. Well, thank you again. This is just a fantastic story. And I remember being there, listening to all this at the time, just being blown away. You hear about weird things going on in behind the scenes in business and hardware and everything, but very rarely do you ever get to see it happen in real time in front of the public and on so many levels with so many people. There's so many cast of characters in this whole thing, from Chris Cardillo to Wojda to Gamester 81, Eli, and even Pat the NES Punk. All these people just contributing to this drama. It was like the greatest season of television that I'd ever seen.
It was almost like a soap opera, because a lot of the time, during the Toy Fair, you could literally sit on Atari Age, just keep hitting refresh and just follow the story like an episode. It was just crazy. It really was. And to some people at the time, it just became all encompassing, but sadly it never really broke outside of that into, the mainstream press and never got really picked up. But wow, it was just the craziest thing to just be a part of and just to follow along like that. It really was.
Eventually someone like Internet Historian or Down the Rabbit Hole is going to cover this, I know. But anyway, thank you for being on the episode. This has been a fantastic interview. This has been Neil for the Gaming Hipster. We have a Patreon, which is ravinghipster.com. For $2 a month, there's extra bits of the gaming show. There's also a bunch of movie commentaries, because I've been doing movie commentaries forever. Like I said, it's just $2, and you can download whatever you want, cancel any time, because that's how Patreon works. I don't care. I'm just happy that you're listening. And my guest has been Mike Kennedy.
No, it hasn't.
Oh my God. Oh, that's something I will be sure to include any of the gaps in the bonus section of the podcast. My guest has been Mike James. I promised myself I wasn't going to screw that up, and then I did it. Mike James, author of Smoke and Mirrors, The Rise and Fall of a Serial Anti-Preneur, also co-host of the Retro Gaming Roundup with Scott Schreiber. Who are the other guys? Sparklepuss and
Sparklepuss and Dave Lanke.
Yes, and a fantastic podcast. Really long, but you really get your. I almost want to say get your money's worth, but it's free.
It's free, completely free.
It's one of the greatest podcasts, one of the best retro gaming podcasts out there. So,
and I'm going to be really cheeky and give out the URL for that. So that is at retrogamingroundup.com.
Yeah, because I would have screwed up and not given that.
Yeah, and the Kickstarter for the book has finished. It finished on Friday, but we do have a website, and you can read through information about the Kickstarter. And obviously, when the book goes on general sale, you can pick up a copy there if you missed out on the Kickstarter. And that website is colecochameleon.org. And there's a great story in the book about how we came to own that URL.
Okay. Oh, and one last note, because you just brought that up. I did, like I said at the beginning of the show, I was doing the deep dive into this to do some research for the interview. And I was like, if only there was some sort of timeline that I could pull up. And it's right down the website. I'm like, oh, good. I can download all these podcasts, go to YouTube, do. I got everything. And just like in 2 days, I binged it. But anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you to Mike James for being on the show. And we'll see you again next month.
All right. Cheers, Neil. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Like a robot. Retro gaming news, reviews, opinions, and more from around the world. You're listening to Retro Gaming Roundup.
All right, got one here from TV's Mr. Neil. Don't know if you ever saw this, but it might be funny to have it on your show. Here's a Craigslist ad for an old CRT TV from the 90s, $250 or better for a 12-year-old standard definition TV. All right, let's see. Okay, it's from Charlottesville. Ruckersville, Virginia. Holy crap, that's funny. It says, okay, I thought it was Charlottesville, like North, South Carolina, whatever it is. This is just down the road from me. Ruckersville is about 30 minutes west of me. So let's see what this local boy has to say. This Panasonic TV has a 32-inch color screen that gives a great display. It comes complete with its matching remote control as an excellent working condition. It's quite the classic optimal television to watch sporting events, movies, television shows, and more on. This type of television defines Super Bowl Sunday, as well as Thanksgiving football watching. Excellent satisfaction guaranteed. For further info, please call me. Cash up front, $250 or best offer, no haggle. Yes, and it truly is just a basic TV. So I'm guessing that one did not sell.
Won't I go? There's a bloke here, won't I go?
I remember he actually took a picture of the back of the console, which revealed that it was a mini Super Nintendo. Oh. I'm sorry, I was muted.
You were?
Yeah. And I just went into this huge spiel about...
and that was the best speech you've ever made on the Gaming Hipster.
Probably, but fortunately I have a redundancy and I can just patch that in. I'll give you like a very brief synopsis of what I was saying. I was basically saying that there was like so much shifting sand with dealing with Kevtris that he would just like bleed these developers, and I'm having a bad time. Yeah, it was a very good speech, and I'm having a very bad time summarizing it. But basically, what I was getting to was that all the shifting sand made it so that there was really no prototype to deal with, and so it led to the famous or infamous New York Toy Fair prototype,
yeah,
which suspiciously looked like it was a Jaguar shell with a somewhat familiar looking board inside.
Produced at